So welcome everyone and hello to our virtual Humanities Institute. And I am Adrián Pérez Melgoza, the director of the Institute, and would like to extend the warmest welcome to all of you, and especially to today's speaker, Professor Fred Maus, who comes to us from Virginia, all the way thanks to technology. So our event today will be introduced and coordinated by Professor Ryan Minor from the music department. Minor is a specialist in the musical and political culture of Germany in the long 19th century, with a special emphasis on the study of opera as the site of cultural, political, and social struggle for power, both symbolic and real power. Professor Minor is the author of choral fantasies, music, festivity, and nationhood in the 19th century Germany, published by Cambridge University Press. And he has also published in the leading journals of music, music history, and musicology, and is a regular contributor to anthologies and encyclopedias of music. He currently serves as the co-executive editor of the journal Opera Quarterly. Closer to us, Professor Minor is a member of the advisory board of the Humanities Institute and remains a key contributor to our intellectual and academic work, and we thank him for it. So it is my pleasure now to pass the virtual microphone to Professor Ryan Minor. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your patience with the glitches.
And thank you, Adrián. It's now my pleasure to introduce to this community Professor Fred Maus, coming to us from over Zoom, obviously from the University of Virginia. He's, as many of you know, but many who are hearing his work today for the first time, he's one of the longtime pillars of that department, as well as various fields of musical scholarship. For someone of my vintage, which is to say going to graduate school in the 90s, reading two essays of Professor Maus's, one, Music as Drama, that took a really sort of strong and inquisitive and nuanced textured look at narrative and how narrative theory could inform accounts of music and of musical listening. And a few years later, his essay, Masculine Discourse in Music Theory, which was an absolutely foundational text for thinking about how one does analysis, how one does music theory, and all the imbrications in terms of sexuality and gender that get involved in that enterprise. These two essays were absolutely fundamental for me and for everyone, I think, in the 90s, in going to graduate school and to this day, in thinking about new musicology, but also what we might call a new music theory as well. Leading to questions also very much with us today about the interdisciplinarity, both of music studies as well as a kind of interdisciplinarity of music itself, whatever that might be. So that's, of course, earlier on. Professor Maus has then gone on to serve in a number of capacities at the forefront of musical scholarship, particularly around issues of sexuality and of popular music and their intersections, as we'll hear about today. He was a founding member of the editorial board of Women in Music, the journal. He was the first chair of the queer research group of the Society for Music Theory, and more recently is a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Music and Queerness. Responding to the talk is Professor Lisa Dietrich, as you know, as many of us know at Stony Brook, professor and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's also the person who introduced Sarah Ahmed on these very Zoom screens a few weeks ago. Her research has addressed, among many things, queer theory, critical medical studies, and AIDS, and she's also from Georgia. So for all of these reasons was an obvious first choice as respondent to Professor Maus's talk today on the B-52s. So we thank you, Professor Dietrich, for agreeing to this, and also, of course, to Professor Maus for his talk, which is entitled The B-52s, Loss and Defiance. So thank you again, and we all welcome over Zoom Professor Maus to Stony Brook.
Thanks so much, Ryan. What a really nice introduction. I appreciate it. And I want to say I'm very grateful for this invitation from the Humanities Center. Really looking forward to interacting with those of you who are here. And special thanks to Adrian, who was fantastic at working with me on figuring out all the details of this. So I'll begin by putting something up on the screen. So you should have an image there. It's a list of the recordings of the B-52s. The B-52s are a United States rock and pop band from the late 1970s on. Their main record releases are 7 albums and an EP. 6 of the albums easily group as 3 pairs, the albums within each pair stylistically and thematically linked, along with 2 outliers. The 52s and Wild Planet, Whammy and Bouncing Off the Satellites, Cosmic Thing, and Good Stuff. The partially completed and then abandoned album Mesopotamia, and the much later Funplex. A 1998 compilation, Time Capsule, Songs for a Future Generation, included 2 new songs. In October 1985, band member Ricky Wilson died of AIDS-related illness. The members of the group were close friends. Ricky Wilson's sister, Cindy Wilson, was in the band, and he and band member Keith Strickland had been friends since their teen years. Ricky Wilson's death was traumatic, marking a stark before and after in the life of the band. Today, I will explore the effect of this loss on the band's music. I begin with a description of the development of the B-52s up to 1985, and the completion of Bouncing Off the Satellites, nearly done when Ricky Wilson died. And I'm going to put up an image. So there they are, and the cover of their first album. And these are, some of you know this very, very well. Some of you might not. Fred Schneider. Fred Schneider, Keith Strickland, Kate Pearson, Ricky Wilson, and Cindy Wilson. B-52s were at the origin of a thriving, unconventional popular music scene in Athens, Georgia, a small city with a large state university. The scene was rooted in the intersection of queer residents and art school students and faculty. The B-52s began as a group of friends. The personal closeness of the band members became part of the music, which offered the sound of people taking pleasure in being together. This is true in a special way in the first 2 albums, where the crystalline textures leave the distinct contributions of each band member fully audible. Ricky Wilson played guitar, Strickland played drums. The other 3 members were the band's vocalists. Kate Pearson sang and played keyboard. Fred Schneider recited and ranted, often with exaggerated comic affect, sometimes on or around melodic pitches, sometimes not. Cindy Wilson sang with the others, sometimes with Pearson in female voice songs. She also sang memorable solo songs. She and Schneider sometimes added instrumental parts, for instance, on bongos or toy piano. There was no perceptible hierarchy among the performers. The atmosphere of this gathering of family and friends was celebratory and open. Within the middle-class white milieu of the band's audiences, anyone, it seemed, was invited to join the party, sharing the joyful social inclusiveness that the band exemplified. Their nickname, the world's greatest party band, encapsulates their ebullience as well as their devotion to danceable music. There is always a sense of joy and conviviality in the B-52s' collaborative music making, but there are serious songs on a variety of topics, and the overtly silly songs often have darker undercurrents. And there is a pervasive political edge to the band's sense of community. The B-52s were 2 women and 3 gay men. Strickland and Ricky Wilson, men playing instruments associated with masculinity, may not have been obviously gay to their audiences, though they brought spirited, non-macho energy. Schneider, reluctant for years to name his sexual identity in public, could only have been read as gay. Pearson and Cindy Wilson were different from many women in popular culture, not offering themselves as sexual objects seeking the approval of men. Instead, they reveled in the imagery of femininity, taking it as a plaything, choosing an array of bizarre retro clothing and astonishing wigs, and taking on a range of vocal personas. They inhabited femininity somewhat as drag queens do, in loving but disrespectful fascination with femininity forging artifice. Crucially, the members of the B-52s all stood apart from the socially empowered male role within compulsory heterosexuality. The band constituted an alternative to that ubiquitous power structure, and their celebratory style emphasized the pleasure in this alternative. Acceptance of diversity and a loving desire to take care of outsiders come up directly in the lyrics of There's a Moon in the Sky. If you're in outer space, don't feel out of place, because there are thousands of others like you. The complement to this acceptance of difference comes in songs that parody normative heterosexuality and masculinity. In Lava, the vocalists gather with great excitement to watch a volcano erupt. Lava is initially a figure for sexual heat shared by male and female characters in the song. But after 2 minutes, the volcano is also a penis, and the song offers a grandiose depiction of sex organized around male ejaculation. In Strobe Light, a male character is excited because he will soon make love to a woman under a strobe light. The man has a sexual fantasy that he is ready to impose on the woman without, it seems, asking whether she is interested. He simply announces the fantasy and the time of the upcoming act. Such songs display and poke fun at male sexual self-importance and the subordinate roles it creates for women. Often in these songs, Schneider plays the role of a straight man. The goal is not to pass as straight. Rather, the songs evoke friendship between women and gay men. Behind the backs of straight men, the B-52s can mimic and laugh at heterosexual dynamics and at the more universal potential of sexual desire to inspire laughable behavior. Song for a Future Generation is about heterosexual coupling and reproduction. All 5 band members sing, men in one unison group, women in the other. The song is in 2-line stanzas followed by a refrain. Each line of the stanzas states an aspiration to some identity, almost always a position of power. Men sing one line, women sing the other, an octave apart. The identities named are gender appropriate or gender neutral. For example, in the first stanza, the women sing, "Want to be the ruler of the galaxy." And then the men sing, "Want to be the king of the universe." And the refrain is, "Let's meet and have a baby now." It is a comic encapsulation of normative reproductive heterosexuality. And this is a moment when I feel the limitations of Zoom, because I, at least, and maybe some of you, I think that's very funny, and I wish I could hear you laugh, but that doesn't happen. Okay, then in the last third of the song, the format changes. Gender discipline dissolves as the men sing over and over, "Want to be mother, father, daughter, son, captain, want to be ruler, king, and empress." The women accompany this with a wordless pattern in a low register, breaking the previously clear registral contrast of men and women. Suddenly, this anthem to reproductive heterosexuality confuses binary gender verbally and sonically. Cindy Wilson's solo songs with the band are often intense, depicting overwhelming emotion through vocal lines that shatter into white-hot blurts of pain or fall into fragmented dejection. Some of her solo songs are about the pain of failed relationships with men. Her harrowing expressiveness is the flip side of masculine entitlement. In these songs, the female character's dependency may provoke ambivalence or critique, even as Cindy Wilson's singing invites empathy. Some of the band's songs honor individual fictional women, such as the alien from Planet Claire who appears at the beginning of the first album, or the woman working in a shop and waiting happily for her boyfriend in Summer of Love, or the magical seeming woman in She Breaks for Rainbows, who knows where the rain goes. 52 Girls, a song in which the lyrics consist of girls' names, contributes to the band's celebration of women, as does Cake, in which two women talk together about the sensuous pleasure of making and eating cake. In Legal Tender, women cheerfully print counterfeit money in the basement, reframing their domestic setting to rebel against the more usual situations of women depending on men for support or working for less money than men are paid. Schneider's exaggerated speech song has none of the calm authority of conventional entitled masculinity. Like Cindy Wilson, he often sounds desperate or frantic. As mentioned, his performance style is easy to read as gay. This is true visually and vocally. The band's lyrics do not explicitly identify Schneider's characters as gay. One song, Quiche Lorraine, assembles gay stereotypes in representing a man whose poodle has run away. Otherwise, there are flashes of gay connotation based on stereotypes. In Rock Lobster, Schneider's narration begins, "We were at the beach. Everyone had matching towels." In Throw That Beat in the Garbage Can, a man complains about a rhythm that excites him too much. "Stop that beat. It makes me apprehensive. Sweat ruins my clothes. They are very expensive." In 1998, Barry Walters wrote that there are few bands as singular, as specifically American, and yet as downright homo as the B-52s. The description as homo, which I take to mean gay male, is not wrong, but leaves out much of the band's politics of diversity. The qualities I've described, broad inclusiveness, depiction of heterosexuality as men's sexual self-aggrandizement and women's acquiescence or suffering, joyful depictions of women apart from dependency on men, along with a vivid gay male presence in Schneider's performances, are best summarized as queer in the political sense that the term came to have from 1990 on. The B-52s celebrate difference and resist norms. Their anti-normativity centrally addresses the roles specified for men and women in compulsory heterosexuality and extends in a general, non-specific way to other norms. From the beginning, critics routinely described the band as campy. Schneider firmly rejected this, feeling that his strongest affiliations are with Dada and Surrealism. Camp can refer to objects from the past that were intended seriously, but have come to be seen as somehow too much and are savored as such. It also refers to the contemporary aesthetic sensibility that is drawn to such objects and to new objects created for camp appreciation. And it refers to a gay male style of self-presentation through exaggerated, often ironic emotionality and a mix of masculine and feminine coded behavior. The B-52s are campy in all of these ways. The reuse of older popular materials, especially from the 1950s and 60s, is one of the most frequently mentioned aspects of the B-52s style. Such recovered objects are camp, as is the band's enjoyment of them. The B-52s also offer newly created camp, as in Song for a Future Generation, and there is Schneider's voice. But there is much more than camp in the B-52s' music and performances, and Schneider's redirection toward Dada and surrealism is useful. The anarchic playfulness and unpredictable emotion of Dada are strongly present in much of the band's work. And surrealism, the program of recovering the imagination as it is found in the experience of children and in dreams and free association, is abundant. Like dreams, the songs often bring together disparate meanings and affects in paradoxical conjunction. Some early songs, like Devil in My Car, Private Idaho, Quiche Lorraine, and Big Bird, are effectively confusing, both hilarious and frightening. Enjoyment of the band's humor and charm does not preclude a visceral response to what is unnerving and scary in their music. In their later albums, the surrealism tends toward play rather than dread. The first two albums document the sound of the band's early live performances, a spare sound with agitated propulsive drumming, one guitar, and farfisa organ. Harmonies are thin, often fifths with no third. The two women often sing in parallel fourths or fifths. It is a hard-edged, unsentimental sound, completed by the constant intensity of the vocal performances. The band's next three projects moved away from the sound of live performance. Mesopotamia was a failed attempt to collaborate with David Byrne as producer. Byrne's hand is all too heavy. The sense of live performance is gone, and the meticulous accompaniments stand apart from the vocals, which sound rough and unintegrated. Byrne's particular flavors of beauty and whimsy dominate. Whammy and Bouncing Off the Satellites use drum machines and synthesized sound along with other instruments in the latter album Against the Will of the Band. All three include wonderful songs, but many admirers of the band find these releases unsatisfactory. In particular, these projects lose the vivid sense of five individual performers interacting, the sense of joyful community that was fundamental in the first two albums. As mentioned, in 1985, Ricky Wilson died of AIDS-related illness. The group's fourth album, Bouncing Off the Satellites, was nearly finished. Ricky Wilson's unique, perhaps queer guitar style, with a missing string and unusual tunings, was one of the defining aspects of the B-52s, especially on the first two albums. He and Strickland had made music together since high school. Deeply shocked by Ricky Wilson's death, the band did not tour in support of the new album, and they were not sure the B-52s could continue. In 1987, though, Strickland began working on a new song that would become Deadbeat Club. Cindy Wilson and Pearson visited him at that time. They improvised together on the song In Progress, drawing on memories of the band's early days in Athens. By 1988, the band was creating new music again. Cosmic Thing, released in 1989, was by far their most successful album, taking the band quickly to live performances in large arenas, and it remains their best known. Happily, Cosmic Thing returned to the sound of a live rock band with guitars, trap set, and keyboards. Additional performers beyond the four band members enriched the sound, which has none of the starkness of the first two records. Good Stuff continued in a similar style. Strikingly, the darker, frightening qualities of earlier music, especially in the first two albums, are absent with the exception of one song, Bushfire. The band's new material did not refer explicitly to Ricky Wilson's death. The mix of pathos, humor, and strangeness in earlier songs and the band's established style of queer surrealism were not suited to mourning an appalling recent loss, or so the B-52s seem to have felt. Two B-52s songs do allude unmistakably to the death, though inexplicitly. Another, by the Cindy Wilson Band, names Ricky Wilson directly. All three songs are uncharacteristically direct and serious in tone. Dreamland on Good Stuff is earnest throughout, with none of the B-52's characteristic humor. Near the end, the lyrics refer directly to death. The friends that have walked on before us are waiting to take us to laughter and dancing. The friends that have walked on before us are waiting to take us to the sky. Of course, listeners will think of Ricky Wilson. In 2003, Cindy Wilson performed with a group called the Cindy Wilson Band. One of their songs, Ricky, is a direct expression of pain. Cindy Wilson sings in the same fragmented, piercingly expressive style as her most emotional solos with the B-52s. The song recounts a dream of catching sight of Ricky Wilson. Then nature seems to mourn with silent birds and dried up streams. What do you do when the sky falls and the trees are bent down? The song is desolate. What do you do when you can't cry no more? In a few words, the song refers to Ricky Wilson's and the B-52s' characteristic style. You were outrageous, but fun. And here's the beginning of that song.
Dreams that Ricky's walking down the street in a crowd, and I ran after him. You're his name out loud. I said, Ricky, where you going? Ricky, where you going? And he turned around and smiled and walked ahead.
Another song that can be heard as mourning Ricky Wilson, Deadbeat Club, is appropriately reflective in mood and yet deeply engaged with the nonconformity and wildness of a group of friends who became the B-52s, describing those qualities enticingly. As I mentioned, this was the song with which the B-52s began to work together again after Ricky Wilson's death. And in improvising on Strickland's ideas for the song, Strickland, Pearson, and Cindy Wilson brought in memories of their past in Athens. Strickland recalled, I was picturing Ricky playing along with me and thinking about him a lot while writing the music. I was also thinking about Athens and our life there. The song is very autobiographical. We actually lived those images. Inexplicitly, but deeply, the song mourns. It embodies the aspect of mourning in which one revisits memories of the lost object. By evoking two times the present of remembering and implicitly of painful loss and the past of nonconformist exuberance, it effectively mourns Ricky Wilson's death while strongly affirming the distinctive identity of the B-52s. And I just put the lyrics up. After a spoken introduction, Deadbeat Club begins in past tense in first person singular. Someone remembers a time when she was good at talking, it seems, and full of caffeine. The grammatical number changes to plural and the reminiscence continues with more, it seems, about caffeine and talking, and then suddenly a statement of collective identity. We belong to the Deadbeat Club. In the recording, one can't tell whether the tense has changed in the last line of this verse, we belong or we belonged. And I've given the lyrics as they appear with the album, where there's a decision, but in the performance, not so much. The talking was part of belonging to a group, deadbeats, people who talked and drank coffee instead of working. Similarly, in the recording, the spoken introduction marks a contrast between getting a job and trying to think. A new section begins, and then the plural subject sings from the present about future plans, announcing an indiscriminate search for something and a game of dancing in the rain in torn sheets, revealing a sensuousness that does not care about proper clothes or staying dry. This leads to a refrain, a statement of identity, now in present tense. We're the Deadbeat Club. The words continue as though describing a present project of going out for beer. And then, when the lyrics identify the music on the jukebox, it seems the group has arrived in the bar. The statement of identity expands. We are wild girls, or we are wild girls and boys, as well as belonging to the Deadbeat Club. It's sometimes hard to hear whether they're singing we're that is, we are wild girls, or we were wild girls. There are more plans for fun, crashing a party in Normal Town, a party held by people who have the contrasting identity of normal people. It's also actually the name of part of Athens, Georgia. Followed by skinny dipping, which, like the dancing in the rain, shows a willingness to shed clothes and get wet. Finally, the lyrics ventriloquize a response from outsiders. Oh no, here they come. Perhaps this is how the hosts of the Normal Town party feel as the deadbeats approach. Apart from projecting horror or disdain onto the observers of this club, this ending also attributes a kind of future status. A song that began by recalling the past now depicts the deadbeats as something impending. After the spoken introduction, the song opens with Cindy Wilson alone. Then, as the lyrics change to plural number, Pearson joins in. It is as though Cindy Wilson remembers and thereby stirs Pearson's memories, leading her to join the conversation. The first part of the song is in a kind of conversational chanting, somewhat like recitative. When the song moves into present tense, it adopts a more melodic style. This musical difference matches the lyrical difference between past tense narration and present experience. The music mostly avoids cadences. Specifically, it avoids cadences in which tonic harmony coincides with melodic motion down to the tonic. At 3 points, the music for the lines, "We belong to the deadbeat club," and both times, "Wild girls and boys going out for a big time," the melody descends to the tonic, but the harmony is dissonant. And I know that these comments are for some portion of this audience and not for everyone. At both occurrences of the line, "In torn sheets in the rain," the melody seems to lead down to the tonic, but at the last moment, the third scale degree appears above, averting the perfect cadence and initiating a rapid rise to the climactic refrain, "We're the deadbeat club." So the idea is the melody is kind of on its way down, and then another note appears, and then suddenly it shoots up, okay, for the kind of climactic refrain. These evaded cadences refuse to let phrases end, refuse to let a passage of music move definitively into the past. There is tension in this song between descending to the cadence, accepting the deadening beat that ends motion, and instead rising to an affirmation of present identity. The band directly experienced the uncertain negotiation of past and present identity in the process of creating the song. It is fitting that the triumphant refrain is also an emblem of characteristic B-52s sounds. There are high parallel fifths in the women's characteristic counterpoint. Schneider joins below, intoning Deadbeat Club, campily experimenting with a variety of pronunciations. And I'm going to move now to the whole song, which we will listen to.
I'm trying to think.
Should be going down. The members of the B-52s mourned Ricky Wilson mostly in private, not in their music. But another aspect of their later music responds to his death and to HIV/AIDS more generally. From Cosmic Thing on, there is ongoing celebration of pleasure and sexuality, a dissident stance in an environment where non-monogamous sex was under attack, blamed for the epidemic. In mainstream ideology about the epidemic, sex partners were to be viewed with suspicion and tested for the virus if possible. Queer sexuality was denounced, and monogamy was regarded as the only responsible practice. And when non-monogamy and especially gay promiscuity were stigmatized, this was a condensation of much wider cultural negativity about sex and pleasure. Deadbeat Club can be heard as a response to homophobia and anxiety about sex, attitudes that intensified after the arrival of HIV/AIDS. There is cheerful, intransigent queerness in the description of a group of girls, some of whom are also boys. The wet nakedness of dancing in the rain and skinny dipping can be heard as affirming the messy pleasures of the sex that we learned to call unsafe. Skinny dipping evokes, among other things, the act that we came to call barebacking. The careless pleasure of torn sheets contrasts delightfully with the anxiety of torn condoms. The opposition between work and sociability, central to the song, can be heard as encoding the opposition between procreative and non-procreative sex. Everything in the song praises pleasure in ways continuous with pleasures of sex before and potentially during and after the time of HIV/AIDS. The proud gesture of accepting the term deadbeat, reversing the pejorative discourse, resembles the intransigent acts by which some people name themselves faggot, dyke, or queer. Deadbeat may seem like a mild term in comparison, but its repetitions enforce the repetition of its component, dead, dead, dead. The word beat can evoke sexual activity. Dead beating may be, along with its other meanings, the sex that can never produce children or the sex that may lead to death. The gorgeous song Deadbeat Club flaunts and survives the shaming that these associations invite. More generally, the three albums after Ricky Wilson's death include many songs that praise pleasure, understood as a broad continuum that includes sexual pleasure. The B-52s had always made songs about sex, but before Cosmic Thing, they rarely wrote songs that simply celebrate sex and love. Earlier songs like Lava or Song for a Future Generation have satirical qualities, as I suggested, poking fun at the norms of conventional heterosexuality. Other songs, such as Running Around or Ain't It a Shame, dramatize suffering. Only two songs before Cosmic Thing, Loveland and Summer of Love, offer joyful images of love and sex. Cosmic Thing opens with songs about partying and hanging out, continues with songs partly or mostly about sex, and closes with songs about socio-political worlds. I've listed Love Shack as a song about partying and also about sex. The song is ambiguous about just what a love shack is and what might go on there. Junebug revels in the messiness of sex. Let's get in the mud. I think I'm in love. Rome likens the exploration of a lover's body to exploration of the world. Bushfire is about intensity of experience, burning in a field of molten flowers. It picks up the imagery of sexual heat from lava without the satire. With the environmentalism of Planet Z, the album turns to broader social settings. Planet Z identifies environmental hazards and criticizes news media while hoping for something better. Something good is happening. I feel love has got to come on. Topaz, an especially beautiful song, glimpses a utopia. The instrumental that closes the album, Follow Your Bliss, sustains the mood of Topaz. Good Stuff begins with a song in praise of speaking truthfully. The next three songs are about aspects of sexual experience. In Hot Pants, Schneider and Pearson once again play out the roles of a heterosexual pair, but now there is joyful agency on both sides, as Schneider's character praises the joy of ogling short shorts and Pearson's the joy of dressing sexy after work. Good Stuff continues the heterosexual role-playing in a forthright celebration of sexual connections. The earlier satire of compulsory heterosexuality and normative masculinity is no longer prominent. Revolution Earth depicts the joy of lying quietly next to a lover and feeling connected to nature. The group's final album, Funplex, arriving after a long break, maintains the affirmative emphasis on desire and sex. At the end of Good Stuff, the B-52s acknowledge the risk of their emphatic sex positivity. They will be regarded as a bad influence, a label that they proudly accept, as they previously accepted the label deadbeat. In Funplex, they happily affirm, again in reverse discourse, their deviant ingredient. In Revolution Earth, Pearson sings that as she lies with her lover, we know that we're alive if we weren't sure before. The later albums of the B-52s promote life, the pleasures of love and sex, merging with sociability and nature. In a time when HIV/AIDS had no effective therapy and anti-sex attitudes were commonplace, the group stood with those who wanted to maintain the momentum of sexual liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s. The tone of this work is sometimes playful, sometimes earnest, but always committed to those values. Thus, the B-52s honor Ricky Wilson, and as the dedication of Good Stuff puts it, all of our brothers and sisters who are living with HIV. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Maus. And if you're ready with Professor Friedrich.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So let me just say thank you for your paper, Professor Maus. I appreciate you sending me a draft, and so I got to kind of read and think about this a little bit, but I'm going to keep these short and just get the conversation going a little bit here today. So let me just begin by saying, as Ryan asked me, I think, to comment, I'm not a music scholar at all. And I think Ryan asked because I study illness and illness politics, and I also really look closely at the political and aesthetic responses to HIV/AIDS in particular. And also, as Ryan said, I grew up in Georgia. But what Ryan didn't know when he asked me was that truly the Athens and Atlanta music scene of the 1980s was actually the milieu in which I became queer. So indulge me for a minute in just kind of some nostalgic recalling of memories of dancing to Rock Lobster with my high school friends in Atlanta. I want to kind of just give a little brief glimpse of that. I will say the B-52s were not my favorite Athens band. I kind of preferred the jangly melancholy of REM. Okay, so I'll say that right now. But I have really totally magical memories of listening and dancing to the B-52s music. And I think that's probably the case for some of you of a certain age. And I'll just say that two of my very closest friends, Jan and Mary, were huge fans of the B-52s. And I could tell you stories about sort of what a queer couple they were. And I'll just say that, for example, they're heterosexual, cis heterosexual women, but they were accused of being lesbians in high school, and they just ran with it rather than away from it. And I think of the B-52s as kind of actually creating the context in which they could do that. And of course, for someone like me, that was like sort of fun to watch. And let me just say and that's all that, I'm not going to talk more personally about my high school friends. But the paper provides a kind of brilliant tour through the B-52s music. And I think even, Fred, that you kind of managed to echo the form and the content of their music and performances a little bit. So I really appreciate that, the anti-hierarchical and the anti-normativity of their music. It's really kind of exciting to see that. The thing The couple of things that I want to mention are kind of under the theme of queer, I guess, queer geographies. So, and then also queer reproduction a little bit. But so as a queer kid from Georgia who eventually relocated to New York, I've always really been annoyed, and you don't do this, Fred, so don't worry, but I've been annoyed by a certain New York provincialism that generalizes about the backwardness of other places, especially Southern places. And so one of the things that I think is really important to kind of think about is it was the Alabama Shakes, the lead singer of the Alabama Shakes, who I think said something to the effect of, "There's no queer like Southern queer." And I think it's really interesting to think about Southern spaces as queer spaces or potentially queer spaces. And so obviously, I think we know college towns in the South are kind of queer spaces, but I think we have to kind of think about that space. And then also sort of rural spaces. And I'm thinking here about someone like John Howard's ethnography, Men Like That, a Southern queer history about queer in Mississippi, growing up queer in Mississippi. And so thinking about what I kind of want to think about is these links between rural and urban. So, you know, the around Athens and the link between Athens and Atlanta, and then also the link between Athens and Atlanta and New York. And then also the B-52s link between New York City and upstate New York. And you sort of touch on this, but this is not what I don't think this is what your project is, where you're going with it entirely, but I think it's really important to kind of think about the relationships between these different queer geographies and to kind of decenter New York City. And this is what it seems to me that the B-52s are kind of important in doing that work. So you do kind of mention that the two women inhabited a kind of femininity, somewhat like drag queens, and drawing on their sort of experiences of New York City's drag performances. But of course, they're drawing on the drag performances that they were seeing in Atlanta and in Athens. And actually, there's this kind of interesting thing where a place like the Limelight, for example, was that, you know, everybody, folks who are from New York here, of course, know the Limelight in New York, but it actually sort of started first in Atlanta. So I really want to think about how we better understand the relationships and the queer relationships between spaces. And I think actually music is what helps us do that a little bit because of the way music moves. And the other sort of point is, you know, I think it's in the Love Shack video, we see RuPaul, right? I think he's in that video. And of course, RuPaul is another, like the B-52s, another person who kind of came from Atlanta and went to New York City, and these sort of kind of understanding these connections. So those connections are sort of important, and they're not sort of one way. There's not one trajectory. There's a sort of indirect and connections between these places. So that would be my first comment, which also kind of relates also to thinking about HIV/AIDS and thinking about HIV/AIDS outside of New York as well. And so thinking of the impact of the epidemic outside of New York, and also thinking about the connections between places, rural spaces, Southern places, and New York City, and how epidemics kind of spread. So it seems to me that these sort of queer geographies are much more complex than we usually sort of understand them to be. And I think the B-52s are sort of an emblematic example of that. So that's my first just sort of general comment. I don't know if you want to say anything now or you want me to carry on.
Oh, I'll just say, Yes, absolutely. The whole issue of geography is really important to our to the B-52s and to the reception of the B-52s, and it's not simple at all. They really got the idea of becoming a commercially viable band by going to New York and finding that people liked them. And I think the image, I don't know what it would have been like in Georgia, and that's a very interesting question, but I think the image nationally of the Athens scene was that by some miracle, there was a kind of downtown New York bohemia in this place where you would never expect it. And a lot of the kind of appeal of the Athens scene was the way that it just didn't match people's notions of what Georgia was. And I think that's very mediated by downtown New York as a kind of natural image of bohemia. So it's very complicated. And after a while, of course, they weren't in Athens anymore. After the first two albums, they weren't particularly part of the Athens scene. So yeah, just to mark that yes, it's a really valuable topic to bring up, and one that's anything but simple.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think this is one of the things that when we think of sort of dominant or hegemonic, we also want to think about that in terms of how we think queer and, you know, and where queer comes from. I think this is just really sort of important to kind of think about. Other comments are about, you know, the discussion of sort of camp and knowingness. And I think you might have cut this out, Fred, but you did of the paper that you presented, but you noted that Fred Schneider didn't particularly like the attribution of camp. And I think this is kind of a really interesting thing in terms of what was going on in terms of his sort of presentation and performance. And I like your reading of that kind of wariness of the camp label, because it seems to sort of suggest a lack of seriousness to Schneider, I guess. And even though, as you know, it's clearly a misreading of camp as a concept and practice. So I really appreciate your kind of close reading, and also that showing that it's a misreading. And I think the B-52s, I completely agree, the B-52s are campy in all of the ways that you mentioned: ironic emotionality, mix of masculine and feminine coded behavior. And that's really one of the things that's actually special about their music. But I was sort of wondering if there's a kind of sense of a sort of, to use a term that Jose Munoz uses, and Greg Bordowitz as well, about a sort of queer structure of feeling that are sort of less obviously knowing and arch and identity based, and so less knowingly political, and whether you think that sort of thing was going on. And I'm kind of thinking about timing again, the 80s, just before we have this sort of growth of queer theory or ideas about queer, and thinking about what their sense, and we certainly, and I'm doing it, I'm identifying them completely as queer, but their sense of their position in relation to a kind of queer culture. And I guess what I'm asking is whether they now sort of embrace that idea of queer, or whether they're still sort of resistant to that sort of identification. So that's maybe a bringing them up to date a little bit question.
Yeah, I don't know that they have ever said what I say about them in this paper, which is that the whole band is queer.
Yeah.
And the anti-normativity is queer. I'm not sure that's a big word for them. But the anti-normativity is everywhere. And it's partly in resistance to compulsory heterosexuality, and partly in evocations of gayness specifically. But it extends very broadly to anyone who feels left out within a kind of white milieu. I mean, I did mention that. There's more to say about that. So it seems to me to match the the notion of queer as a kind of non-specific anti-normativity perfectly. Talking about gayness and specifics of different sexual identities has never really been their thing. Yeah, exception for Kate Pearson, who, somewhat to her surprise, fell in love with a woman who's her partner now.
Yeah.
And she's spoken very sweetly about that. Schneider, there's an interview by Lance Loud, I think from 1994. It's not actually an interview, it's an article describing how he kept making phone calls and pestering Fred Schneider because he wanted him to say that he was gay. And Schneider really, really did not want to do that. And I think, you know, there can be many guesses about reasons for that. But one thing that I think is very, very sensible, I mean, if I thought about the two kind of most important gay bands of the time, it would be the B-52s and somewhat later the Pet Shop Boys. In both cases, there's a very strong resistance to identifying as gay. And also it's almost redundant for them to do that because it's so apparent in like every drop of the music of those two groups. And I think identifying explicitly as gay means using a label that tends to kind of take over the discourse. And people just can't think about anything else once a group has self-identified as having a gay member. And I think both bands did not want that. And the reason why people are often urged to come out is to be helpful to younger people, to be a role model of some kind. And I think in both cases, they were able to communicate very effectively as role models, partly because they didn't use this vocabulary that would get a lot of the public reaction shut down. So that's part of what I sense in those two groups.
Yeah.
Is that pretty clear?
Yeah, that's clear. That's really good. Thank you. And my last point, and this will be really quick because I want other people to be able to jump in, but is about what I would call kind of queer reproduction. And I love your reading of Deadbeat Club is really wonderful, and your kind of emphasis on their emphasis on pleasure, and that's a kind of form of resistance in this moment of HIV/AIDS is really powerful, and I really appreciate that reading a lot. And the quote about Strickland writing the piece, saying I was picturing Ricky playing along with me and thinking about him a lot while writing the music. I was also thinking about Athens and our life there. And there's my dog. The song is very autobiographical. We actually live those images. And so this kind of way that you're looking at the kind of co-temporality of that, trying to go back to that moment. And that moment is also a kind of pre-AIDS moment, I think is really sort of important to emphasize. And so the deadbeat is kind of the accusation of deadbeat is a kind of an offhand, right? Sort of we that's not quite as serious as thinking about what will happen to these people eventually. So I think that's really sort of poignant. But I also was wondering, because I have sort of read this or recall this about Strickland, that he actually, so he's the drummer, but then he plays guitar. And I thought that he sort of tried to mimic or echo Ricky Wilson's guitar playing, which, as you said, was a sort of queer guitar playing with odd tunings. Basically, he would sort of say, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm tuning. And it seems to me that that kind of continues his presence in the band. So you have Strickland playing like Ricky Wilson, having to kind of learn to play like Ricky Wilson. And this becomes a way of kind of reproducing Ricky Wilson as still part of the band. And so I was wondering if you just could talk a little bit about that. That seems like a really interesting queer reproduction or a lineage, a way of kind of bringing him forward with the band that's about the play of the guitar. So that's my comment. But.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't have a lot to say about that, but you're right, of course, that Keith Strickland did try to reproduce a lot of details of Ricky's guitar playing as the band moved forward. I don't especially hear that in the recordings. The guitar playing is so distinctive on the first two albums, and
Yeah.
it's a pretty different sound in Cosmic Thing. But you're right, that's a way of keeping Ricky in the band. Cindy Wilson took time off from the band after Cosmic Thing. She doesn't appear on the next album, their last major album before the 2000s. Good stuff. And it was partly, I mean, the thing that was said publicly about that immediately was that she was raising a child, which was true. But she also said that in performing with the band, she just always had images of Ricky being there, and it was unbearable.
Mm.
And that was a reason why she needed time off.
Yeah.
And that's very poignant.
Yeah.
Her song, Ricky, has never been released commercially. I don't actually know why. I have an MP3 of it on my computer. I've had it for years, and I must have gotten it from some site, but I can't find it anymore. On YouTube, there are recordings of live performances that you can find. And it's pretty much unbearable. It's so, I mean, I find it so, it's so painful. And she's so open in that song. And I can see, you know, deciding that it wasn't really going to be a commercial recording. But, you know, the sense of Ricky hovering around the band is very much part of that decision of hers to take time off.
Thank you.
So that's not as positive as the other evocation of Keith Strickland learning to play the guitar parts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, Lisa. And I want to invite people who have questions just to put a quick note in the chat, and I will look at that. If you haven't quite formulated it yet, I might just sort of take a second to ask how I've been processing a lot of this idea of mourning and lament from my sort of narrow operatic background, and thinking of mourning and lament as something that's often very explicitly sort of gendered feminine, and how that might work in the 80s, especially with a band that is refusing to identify as queer, with a death from HIV/AIDS. Is there a sense in your thinking about sort of the dynamics around reception and around self-presentation, but also around public displays of grief and of mourning, in which a male-focused lament such as this would have been read completely differently? That there's a potential ambiguity around a female singer, whether this was a lover or a sister or a mom or something like that. Whereas I'm thinking of in theater, and particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, all the sort of Larry Kramer and Tony Kushner and all of these sorts of things. That there's gay male lament that is. It's gay male lament, and it's automatically gay, it's automatically male, it's automatically about HIV/AIDS. Do you read, if not the intent, but sort of the sort of reception and effect of this being voiced through female singers, or primarily female singers, as playing off those sort of some of those very dynamics about the refusal to name queerness as such? And the refusal to sort of name sexuality as being something as set as you talked about it later in the paper.
I'm not sure I have a great answer for you, but you're noticing the sound examples that I played of Cindy Wilson's song and of Deadbeat Club are dominated by female voices. Fred Schneider appears very briefly in Deadbeat Club. And that's interesting. Yeah. The other song that I mentioned, Dreamland, is sung by Fred Schneider, and it's quite a peculiar song. It has nothing of his distinctive vocal performance. He actually sings it very straight. It sounds a little studentish. It's not what he was great at. Okay, and I don't think anyone would be drawn to the music by that sound. But he's singing it very earnestly and very directly. And he gets near the end to the part about people waiting for us who've gone on ahead of us. So there is a very veiled male lament. So the person whose lament would have been most pertinent, I suppose, would be Keith Strickland, because they were friends for years and years, as well as, of course, Cindy. And that doesn't get expressed vocally. So, yeah, the Pet Shop Boys sing and sing and sing about HIV/AIDS. Okay, many of their songs touch on it in one way or another, and their characteristic tone is melancholy, and that's a real repository of gay male lament, which is not out by only the thinnest, most easily disrupted veil. Okay, I mean, gay men listen to those songs and they immediately know what they're about. Okay, so that's an example. There is a very beautiful REM song. I'm not going to remember the name of it right now. That's a lament for Kurt Cobain. That's also very, very poignant. But I'm not actually going to be able to give you any kind of clear conceptualization in an answer. You just got me associating here.
Sure. No, thank you. We have a question from Adrian in the chat. I'll just read it. I find the Southerners are very good at performing a public self and also suspending reality, and this comes through in their music. Do you think this would have been harder for them if they were from someplace else like the Midwest? And then she adds, being a Southerner myself.
I don't know, but that's really interesting. And it's, I mean, it points to a difference between the earlier and the later B-52s, I think, which is in the, before Cosmic Thing, I don't think that you would imagine the word sincere as a description of anything that the B-52s did. There's always some kind of irony or distance or playfulness. So there's a way that those songs are not directly self-revealing. And I think sincere is a very good description for lots of what goes on from Cosmic Thing onward, which doesn't mean that it's humorless, okay? But it's meant as expressive, and it's meant to be understood as directly expressive, I think. And that's true of Deadbeat Club, but it's equally true of Love Shack. I think they're not kidding about Love Shack. So. Yeah, that's not a very good answer, Adrian, but that's what comes to mind.
We have another comment in the chat about Kelly Loftus wanted to highlight the use of vintage clothing as being an alternative at the time, not expensive, not off the rack, and yes, camp. If you have any reaction to that comment and the specific sort of self-presentation through the clothing?
Yeah, well, they weren't wealthy. They needed those thrift shops, and they found a way to make it something beautiful instead of just something necessary. And I agree, it's camp, very much so. Yeah, so it's a good point. And I didn't mention vintage clothing, but there it is. It really is vintage clothing from thrift shops that you see them in a lot of the time.
This just thinking about the sort of discussion of drag as well. I think for a lot of people watching drag now, one of the big complaints on Drag Race is, well, she has all the money in the world, she can do this, she can do this, and so someone like Trixie Mattel, who ends up with a sort of B-52s-ish look, has a huge budget for it, and this lament that actually, meant that no, there's a very real reason, material reason why some of the sort of these modes of self-presentation in the 80s and 90s were what they were, and it was budget, and it's not the sort of latter day recreation of it, courtesy of VH1. And Adrian has a question.
Oh, hello, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering in what, I hope it's a fair question, given that you've done a wonderful close reading of many of the songs and of the larger trajectory of the group. What is the reception internationally? Being from Spain myself, I can tell you a little bit, not to go into Lisa's direction, but I can tell you a little bit of the B-52s arriving in Spain as part of the U.S. cultural industry and the global industry that it is, and at a time of a transition to democracy, and being embraced by many of the young people as seeing a similar sensibility that really touch on the performativity of normalcy. That camp also shows the performativity of the normal identities, and allow us to criticize, the imminent past or the immediate past in which we had grown, and show also it was received as postmodern, but a very peculiar way of being postmodern, as celebrating fun, basically. And at the same time being profound simultaneously in a weird way, being profoundly political and fun at the same time. And I wonder if you have done some study of that, of the international reception of the band.
I have not.
I thought it might be not fair, given that it's not your focus, but I thought it would be interesting.
Right. I'll just say that your comments make me think of Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown and Almodovar, and a kind of continuity, a very strong continuity, I think, between his camp humor and the B-52s. So I can see that a country in transition to democracy that produced that filmmaker would also welcome the B-52s.
There's actually a band. There's a band, Alaska. There's a band that is basically, you can see the many connections, Alaska and the Pegamoids is called, the Pegamoids. But Almodovar himself had a band that was very much, inspired in the B-52s, and there are songs recorded by him. So
that is totally fascinating.
Yeah,
and I had no idea. Yeah, I spend a lot of time in Mexico.
Yeah, but I want to be I'm gonna have a baby. I'm gonna spoil it, and I'm gonna eventually I'm gonna make love with him because he's gonna be my perfect lover or whatever. Songs like that are just trying to push all the buttons of the audience, of the older audience, and show the younger audience that they had something to celebrate.
Wow, that is fantastic. Yeah, I'll just say I spend a lot of time in Mexico, and I talk with my friends about music there, and the B-52s do not come up. I know people who know a tremendous amount of English language pop, and they can talk to me for hours about The Cure and the Smiths and Depeche Mode. And the B-52s don't seem to be part of their lives. That's present moment. So I have no idea what the reception might have been in the past.
You kind of mentioned this slightly, but it's also the period of the post-Vietnam War, post-oil crisis, deep crisis in the world, post-Nixon, and I think in that way, post-Franco for Spain was kind of similar in trying to search for. It's like saying nothing of the past works, and we can make fun of it to build the future, something like that. So.
Wow.
We're actually 2 minutes over. I want to thank again Professor Maus for speaking to us today, and really sort of beautiful talk, raising all sorts of issues about about sexuality and self-presentation and pandemics and identity that I think, that resonate in really interesting ways for us and today. And thank you also, Professor Dietrich, and thank you all of you for joining us. And I don't think I'm supposed to end the session officially, but I do note that it's 5:33. So Adrian, if you want to do something more, otherwise we will simply thank you and thank you once again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It was really a wonderful lecture, and we look forward to keep in conversation with you and also reading your stuff as it comes out. Thank you.